This vault was so disturbing that it ran a yearly election for 16 years straight, and losing it meant walking into a chamber to die. Nobody ever checked if that threat was even true. Not once, until 5 people finally did. Here's exactly how that happened, and what they found out the moment they finally refused. The first betrayal at Vault 11 was built underground in the Mojave, one of 6 vaults Vault-Tec put in that stretch of desert, and from the outside, it looked like any other shelter. Families packed what they could carry, said goodbye to whatever they were leaving behind, and walked into a hole in the ground they were told would keep them alive until the world was safe again. None of them knew what they had actually signed up for. Only one person did. The original overseer got the vault's real instructions before the door sealed. The computer would need a sacrifice every year. One resident, picked by the people themselves, killed in a chamber built just for that. If they ever refused to pick someone, the computer would kill everyone instead. The overseer knew this, walking in, and told no one. So when the door closed for good and the system explained, calmly, that someone now had to die every single year, or everyone inside would die at once, the residents weren't just scared out of their minds, they felt completely betrayed by the one person whose entire job had been keeping them safe in the first place. They didn't argue about it for long. They didn't need to. The first vote wasn't close. They picked the overseer, the one person who had known and said nothing, and sent him down to die for it. That single decision, made within hours of the vault door sealing shut for the very first time, is genuinely what the rest of this entire story comes from. The residents had a chance, right at the start, to point their anger at Vault-Tec, at the lie itself. Instead, they pointed it at the one person standing in front of them, killed him, and kept the system running exactly as designed. They didn't break the machine, they just became the ones actually running it, and once the job of overseer and the job of getting killed had become the same job, there was no clean way out of it without someone, eventually, being willing to stand in that same spot and say no. Nobody did. Not for 16 straight years of overseers. And whatever was left of that fear is apparently still active 200 years later. Anyone exploring Vault 11 today walks into sandbag barricades, hidden traps, and at least one computer terminal wired to explode if you try to access it the wrong way, along with the remains of an NCR trooper who clearly didn't make it past whatever was waiting for him. Roy Gottlieb's own terminal password ended up hidden inside a footlocker in the same dorm room where the rest of his belongings sat untouched for 2 centuries, and whatever security he set up around it outlived him by longer than he ever got to live. Something in that vault was still trying to keep people out long after there was nobody left inside it to protect. Nobody ever found out what was actually waiting at the bottom of that hallway until it was already their own turn to walk down it. The chamber. The person who won didn't just get walked into a room and shot. What happened to them is its own part of this story, and how carefully it was built tells you a lot about a system designed to feel safe right up until the second it wasn't. The winning candidate, now overseer, would eventually walk down a long hallway under the office, toward a door that opened onto a single chair facing a screen. A calm, recorded voice walked them the rest of the way, talking to them gently, the way you'd talk to someone who didn't fully understand what was happening, or someone you needed to stay calm for just a few more minutes. Once they sat down, pleasant footage played while the voice told them they'd lived a good life, and that whatever came next would be even better. It sounds like a retirement video. It really isn't that. Then the whole voice changed, just slightly, and asked them to close their eyes. People who worked on this vault have pointed to one more reference behind that scene specifically, the euthanasia sequence from the film Soylent Green, where a man chooses his own peaceful, narrated death surrounded by pleasant images on a giant screen. Vault 11 borrows that exact image and just removes the choice. That's the signal. Panels on both sides of the room slide open, and whatever's waiting behind them, a sentry bot, a pair of protectrons, a robo-brain, rows of turrets, depending on the year, opens fire all at once. There's no second chance built into any of it. The chair, the calm voice, the nice footage, none of that is there to comfort the person sitting in it for their own sake. It's there so the very last thing every single overseer of Vault 11 experienced was the vault telling them this was fine, this was good, right up until it very much wasn't. I genuinely keep coming back to how much careful work went into making the whole thing feel gentle. Vault-Tec didn't need a calm voice or a slideshow to kill someone. A locked door and a gas line does the same job for far less effort. The whole presentation exists for one reason: to make the killing easy to repeat year after year by making sure each death looked and sounded like something other than what it actually was. That's not just one execution being dressed up nicely. Somebody designed a whole system around it, and once you notice that, it's hard to stop noticing it everywhere else in this story too. Somebody scripted that voice. Somebody picked the footage, decided how long the calm part should run before the cue to close your eyes, decided which robots would be waiting behind which wall. A lot of different people had to sign off on a presentation built entirely to make an execution feel like a party, right up until the moment the turrets opened up on whoever was sitting in that chair. One person doesn't build something like that on their own. A whole group does, working together on purpose. Step back from that room for a second, though, and the actual process that decided who sat in that chair each year turns out to be something almost insultingly ordinary by comparison: an election. The election for who dies. The overseer job got filled through an annual election, and since the winner was also that exact year's sacrifice, the entire voting process inside Vault 11 quickly turned into exactly what it sounds like: a real election for who was going to die next. You would honestly think a system built like that would fall apart almost immediately. It didn't fall apart at all. It organized itself. Instead, 6 different voting blocks formed over the years: the Allied Service Workers, the Divine Will Block, the Human Dignity Block, the Justice Block, the United Vault Technicians, and the Utilitarian Block. Each one ran campaigns. Each one printed posters and pamphlets, the same kind you'd see in any small-town election, except every single one was really about deciding who walks into that chamber this year. One surviving campaign flyer for a candidate named Henry Glover spends the whole thing talking about his 6 kids and how proud he is of his honor roll son, before ending with a plea to vote for someone else entirely, a man named Nate Stone, by name, years before Nate's wife Catherine ever became part of this story herself. Another candidate, Donna Haley, ran what might be the strangest campaign in the entire Vault's history, openly telling residents she'd done terrible things, that she'd done 4 such things specifically, without ever saying what those were, that she was grossly unqualified, and that her own administration would be a disaster, hoping that sounding like the worst possible choice was the only way to survive the year. It's somehow the funniest document in the whole Vault, and also one of the saddest. A woman publicly inventing her own crimes because actual guilt was less frightening than winning. The politics didn't go away just because the stakes were death. If anything, they got worse, because every block knew the person they failed to protect this year wasn't coming back next year to get even. A group even formed to act as a neutral referee for the whole process, which is its own small horror once you sit with it for a second. An election watchdog, for an election whose only real job was picking a body. Not everyone went along quietly. A man named Gus Olson worked as ombudsman for the yearly election, and he left behind a speech the player can still find sitting on a podium in the Vault 200 years later. In it, he asks, out loud, whether the residents had ever looked for another way to handle this, or whether they just kept doing it because nobody could picture an alternative. Nobody ever answered him. The elections just continued like they always had. This went on for decades. A new overseer took office, served a short, almost ceremonial term, then walked down to die while the blocks that had spent weeks fighting each other turned straight to the next election. It stopped being an emergency and became something closer to a tradition, complete with its own scandals and grudges. Nobody running those campaigns was a monster the way this franchise usually means that word. They were just people doing politics, inside a system that happened to end every cycle with somebody's death. That's a quieter kind of horror than anything involving FEV or feral ghouls. And it leaves out the part that should bother you the most, because eventually, this system produced someone the easy explanations don't really cover. Someone who didn't just lose an election, she never wanted to win in the first place. Catherine Stone. Her name was Catherine Stone, and she became overseer of Vault 11 by murdering her way into the job, on purpose, to save her husband's life. Her husband's name had already been floated in Vault politics before any of this happened too. A rival candidate in an earlier election had publicly suggested Nate Stone take his place instead, which means the Stone family had been sitting in the crosshairs of this system long before Catherine ever picked up a weapon. By the time of the Vault's last election, the Justice Block had become the single most powerful block inside Vault 11, led by a man named Roy Gottlieb. According to the terminal entries you can find in the Vault's living quarters, Gottlieb and other members of his block sexually coerced Catherine in the run-up to that election, threatening to nominate her husband Nathan as overseer unless she did what they wanted. A nomination from the strongest block in the Vault was close enough to a guaranteed win that it amounted to a death sentence for him. She didn't really have a choice, and she went along with it to try to keep him alive. They nominated him anyway. The coalition of Vault 11 voting blocks, the same group that had spent years presenting itself as a neutral referee, eventually had to postpone that election entirely, putting out a notice blaming what it called the tragic events of the past few days, and promising residents that security was working tirelessly on a number of promising leads. The same notice noted, almost as an afterthought, that catching the killer quickly might conveniently produce a promising new candidate for overseer. Nobody writing that particular memo seemed to notice, or maybe care, how that exact exact sentence sounded to anyone reading it later. Whatever Catherine was before that moment, the records don't really say. What she became after is documented in detail because what she became after is a killer. Out of what the surviving notes describe as desperation, despair, and pure anger, she started killing members of the Justice Bloc one at a time in the days leading up to the final election. It did two things for her at once. It was revenge against the people who had assaulted her and then broken their end of the deal anyway. And it made her, to a traumatized and increasing, desperate community, the obvious next choice for overseer, which meant the obvious next sacrifice, which meant her husband got to live. She won the election that followed almost immediately. Of course she won. A vault that picks its overseer by popularity and fear, in equal measure, was never going to pass up the woman who'd just ended the reign of its most feared bloc. Catherine Stone became overseer knowing exactly what that meant, having engineered her own death specifically so somebody else wouldn't have to die in her place. The vault's own propaganda probably would have called her a murderer who turned on her neighbors. What really happened is closer to a woman who ran every option available to her, inside a system built to offer none, and picked the one outcome where the person she loved most got to keep living. And then, with whatever time she had left, she used the one real piece of power the job gave her, and tried to fix the exact system that had just destroyed her, with no idea that fix was about to cost the vault almost everyone still left alive inside it. Order 745. Catherine's first act as overseer was also her only act as overseer. She signed what the vault's records call Overseer Order 745, and with it, she wiped out the entire election system in one move. No more nominations, no more campaigns, no more blocks deciding through threats and favors whose name went on a ballot that was really a death sentence. From then on, the next overseer would be picked at random by the vault's own computer, with zero human input. Her own order describes it as a way to ensure complete impartiality and fairness going forward. And as close as the records get to her actual reasoning beyond that, she wanted the process to finally be fair to everyone. No more bargaining, no more leverage over anyone's husband or wife, just chance, applied equally. The same fairness the whole thing was supposed to have from day one and never actually did. It was, by just about any normal measure, the single best decision any overseer of Vault 11 had ever made. It was also a direct attack on every bit of power the remaining blocks had spent decades building, and the Justice Bloc, weakened but nowhere near finished, treated it exactly that way. Roy Gottlieb and what was left of the Justice Bloc tried to seize the Vault's food, water, and power systems, hoping to force Catherine's order back through sheer leverage over survival. It didn't stay political for long. Other residents armed themselves in response. Other blocks picked sides or grabbed their own piece of the vault while they had the chance. And what had been, for decades, a cruel but orderly tradition turned into open fighting in the corridors of a sealed vault with nowhere to retreat to, and no way out for anyone. There's no clean death count anywhere in the surviving record because nobody left standing was in any position to keep careful records while it was happening around them. What we do know is the outcome. The fighting killed almost everyone. Not most of the population left. Almost all of it. Vault 11 had run for decades with a population somewhere in the hundreds, big enough to support 6 separate political blocks with real followings. By the time the violence finally burned out, 5 people were left alive in the entire vault. 5 people, total, standing in the wreckage of a community that had spent decades carefully killing one of its own every single year, specifically to avoid an ending that looked exactly like this one. Think about what those 5 had to walk past just to reach the chamber one last time. Bodies that used to be family, neighbors, election rivals, all of it reduced to the same thing by the same fight. They just spent however many days the fighting lasted, watching the last working version of their community tear itself apart over a reform one of their own had tried, honestly, to make things fairer. The decision they made next wasn't some clever plan. There was no plan left to have. It was just 16 years of fear finally running out, and whatever they decided to do with what was left of it would either end this for good or be the last mistake Vault 11 ever got the chance to make. What the 5 found. 5 completely exhausted, deeply grieving people finally sat down together in the middle of a vault that had nearly killed itself trying desperately to keep itself alive, and did the one single thing nobody had ever tried in 16 straight years. They put down whatever weapons they had left. They walked together back to the same chamber that had taken every overseer before them, and told the vault's computer they were done. No more sacrifices. Whatever happened next, happened. What happened next was genuinely the one part nobody inside Vault 11 had ever lived long enough to learn learn for themselves. There's a recording of that exact moment, sitting on a terminal right by the vault's main door, and it isn't a relief. The 5 of them go back and forth about whether they even deserve to walk out after everything that happened to get them there. One of them insists they're finally free to leave, and the others aren't so sure they should be, and the conversation ends with someone hoping that if anyone out there ever hears this, they never have to find out what it took to get this door open. The chamber answered with a message that had been sitting there, unheard, since the day the vault first sealed. It told the 5 survivors they'd made the choice not to sacrifice one of their own, and that they could walk with their heads held high, an example to everyone. Then, it told them the rest. Despite everything they'd been told for 16 years, Vault 11 was not going to be wiped out for refusing. The main door was unlocked. They were free to come and go as they wanted. That's the entire experiment, fully laid bare in one short recorded message that could have played on day 1 if anyone had simply just said no. The threat that justified every single killing for 16 years was never real. It was never going to happen. Vault-Tec built an elaborate, carefully maintained lie just to see how long an ordinary community would keep killing its own people to avoid a punishment that never actually existed in the first place. And the answer is, they did it, until there was almost nobody left to ask the question. The door had been right there the entire time. Nobody touched it until it had already cost them nearly everyone they knew. Knowing that much still doesn't explain why, out of 16 overseers who held that office, not one of them ever actually checked. Why? Nobody ever said no. It would be easy to read all of this as just plain cruelty, and on some level it absolutely is that, but I think that reading misses most of what Vault-Tec was really after with this specific vault. Most vault experiments studied what happens to people under specific, often horrible physical conditions. Extreme gender ratios, chemicals in the air and water, sound designed to break a community down from the inside. Vault 11 didn't need any of that. It introduced exactly one piece of information, the threat of total extermination, and then just watched to see what an ordinary group of people would do with it over time. That's not really a guess about what Vault-Tec was going for either. The people who actually designed this vault have said outright that they built it around Shirley Jackson's short story, The Lottery, where a small town draws names every year and stones the loser to death to keep the town prosperous, and around the Milgram experiment, the real psychology study that measured how far ordinary people would go against their own morals just because someone in a position of authority told them to. In the real Milgram studies, roughly 2 out of every 3 participants kept going all the way to the maximum shock, simply because a man in a lab coat told them it was necessary and that he'd take responsibility. Vault 11 ran the same basic test for 16 years, except the man in the lab coat was a vault computer, and the shock was an actual execution, and the obedience rate, year after year, was effectively 100%. If you enjoyed this video and want to see Fallout's worst vaults explained and ranked in 21 minutes, click the video on the screen.